This conference will now be recorded.
Hello. Hello, everybody. This is Audrey Kidwell with Volunteer Florida. To start, if you could self-mute yourself, that would probably, just so we don't get any background noise. And then just as an FYI, we are going to be recording this webinar, so I'll send it out, and you can share with everybody else in your organization if you would like. And I just want to say welcome to any AmeriCorps or RCAP, our rural community grantees that may be on the call. Thank you for joining us. So during this webinar, again, everyone's going to be muted to avoid the background noise, but there will be times throughout the PowerPoint that I'll unmute you so you can ask questions. Feel free to type anything in the chat box. And then there is some interactive portion that we'll be asking just for you, which you'll use the chat box as well. Just really quickly, I want to remind everyone of the 8 volunteer management practices. They're here on the screen. If you're a VGF or an RCAF grantee, you're very familiar with these as they're a major part of the application. And many organizations had to opt into a few of these so they could work on them throughout the grant year. Again, these are the 8 steps or functions for effectively managing volunteers. VF hopes that you guys are using these as a guideline to effectively engage and track your skills-based volunteers and to increase organizational volunteer practices. The webinar series for the rest of this grant year will be covering one of these 8 topics. And again, it comes from the Volunteering Reinvented, which CNCS released a number of years ago, and you can find that full article on their webpage. So today's topic, as you all are aware, is managing spontaneous volunteers in times of disaster. And so in the room, I have Christy Rojas, the CERT Program Manager.
Thank you, Audrey. As Audrey said, my name is Christy Rojas. I am the CERT Program Manager here at Volunteer Florida. That is Community Emergency Response Teams. We train average citizens in very easy disaster response roles, so that when the disaster occurs, you can help yourself, help your neighbors before help arrives. So you're the help before the help arrives. You're the first responders before those first responders arrive, and you can help us in times of disasters. But I'm also very familiar with spontaneous volunteers, so today we're going to discuss that.
Thank you.
Our first question is, what organization or group do you represent today? Who's on the phone with us? You can type that in the, is there a poll or a chat box?
The chat box. Okay. I see lots of A's, which would represent nonprofit. Again, I guess there are a few people who might have just been calling in. So the question was, what type of organization is represented today? A is nonprofit, B is private, C is government, and D is other. But I think we are definitely getting an overwhelmingly number of A is nonprofits, which are great.
So today we're going to talk about, we have a national principle on spontaneous volunteer management. We're going to discuss that some, and we're going to talk about understanding spontaneous volunteers and volunteer management 101. We're going to talk about who some of our stakeholders are in those unaffiliated volunteer management groups and the importance of public messaging. We're also going to learn about establishing volunteer reception centers, which we'll call them BRCs, and understanding the various roles. And nonprofits, definitely, since that's the overwhelming number of participants we saw, you could definitely have a role in all of these objectives here. So we have the national principles of volunteering, especially in times of disasters. And the history of that really came out of Hurricane Andrew, which is not up here on this slide, but it came from a time of people saw this catastrophic disaster and they really wanted to support. And so volunteers just arrived, and so FEMA saw this need to create the national principles, and those have over the course of disasters have evolved and transformed. But it is really volunteering within the emergency management network, and then the value of affiliation. You'll hear us talk a lot about that today, that being affiliated prior to the disaster is really the best way to assist, and that is part of our public messaging as well. And then volunteer involvement occurs at all phases of a disaster, so in what we like to call blue skies all the way to the recovery process, and we'll discuss that as we go on. So again, we're going to talk about how to build onto existing capacity, and then information management, consistent terminology, and try not to use those acronyms. We like to use affiliated and unaffiliated volunteers, and just having the distinguishable identity between the groups. So what do we know about? What do we know about disaster volunteers? And you can throw some answers in that chat box if you have some ideas about what you know about disaster volunteers. Who are they? Where do they come from? Why do we think they maybe show up?
Someone mentioned that they can't hear. Can someone confirm if they can hear?
Okay.
Oh, okay. Someone can hear. Okay, great.
Thank you.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure.
So volunteers, so some things we do know about volunteers are they're a very valuable resource. Truly, we could not recover or respond from a disaster without volunteers, but they're more valuable to us when they're trained, assigned, and supervised. So there's definitely value in working with volunteers in a disaster, and that comes from a number of places. One of those is that if those are people who are local to the community, they're right there. They're not workers that we have to bring in from the outside. They know those communities, they know those partners, they know those people. That's their home. So they have an invested value in helping their community following a disaster. The other thing is that when it comes to FEMA reimbursement, volunteer hours are worth a lot to us. So there's that economic value we have as well, that financial value. And then again, if volunteers are affiliated before a disaster, they already have that training. We can send them to do those duties that are needed to be done, and then we don't have to take time away from other valuable recovery and response efforts in training volunteers. And then lastly, they have to be willing to coordinate with, they have to be willing to be coordinated by emergency management experts. So Volunteer Florida's role in times of disasters is that we work together with all of these other nonprofit and voluntary groups to coordinate the efforts so we're not duplicating efforts and that we're not doing more harm to both our community, the recovering community, and to ourselves. And then, of course, there's information is vital to the management of these volunteers that come in. So having that open line of communication. Can your agency use spontaneous or unaffiliated volunteers to serve their mission after a disaster? A is yes, B is no, C is don't know. So we're seeing mostly A's here. I did see a few C's, and the truth is, following a disaster, most organizations can use spontaneous volunteers, and you may just never have experienced a disaster through your organization and might not be aware of the role they can play. And so that's a lot where Volunteer Florida would come in to help you with that. What are some reasons people converge at disaster sites? Excuse me. reasons we see people converge at a disaster site. They want to help. They've just seen this on national television, and they just feel helpless, and they want to do something. And I mentioned a lot of times it's your community, so you show up. Or they've been a disaster survivor themselves, and they've had someone help them, so they want to come help. And they're just curious. There's anxiety. There's a lot of reasons that people may just show up to the disaster site. So we have another poll question. Has your organization drafted volunteer reception center job descriptions? A is yes, B is no, and C is don't know. So I'm glad to see several A's. I'm glad to know that your organization has drafted volunteer reception center job descriptions. And I will tell you, after following Hurricane Michael, this most recent disaster, we saw a lot of our community stand up volunteer reception centers. So having those plans in place prior was really great for them. So Volunteer Management 101 is planning. So writing the job descriptions for possible disaster roles and the required skills. And then establishing the procedures and having those MOUs in place. Those may be with who's going to run your volunteer reception center, where your volunteer reception center is going to be located, or a number of other things that you may need to coordinate ahead of time. And then receiving and placing the public messaging to spontaneous volunteers, registering those volunteers, and interviewing those volunteers. And then, of course, orientation and training. Safety is very important following a disaster, and having that safety training for everyone, those working your volunteer reception center and those volunteers coming in. And then specific job training depending on what the job level they're going to do, what the how risky the task is, the complexity, and, of course, the level of experience. And then supervising and recognizing, watching for signals of critical incident stress, ensuring that volunteers take care of themselves, monitoring changing situations in the disaster area, recognizing accomplishments as they happen, and then evaluating. We can always learn a lesson for future disasters, good and bad. So spontaneous volunteers, they're going to show up whether or not we're prepared for them. So plans for spontaneous volunteers shouldn't be spontaneous since we know they will arrive. So it's better to identify possible roles, those job descriptions as we mentioned, who's going to receive them, where our VRCs are going to be located, and policies and procedures before the disaster happens. So again, I'll go back to safety training. Safety is critical following a disaster. So making sure we follow making sure you follow all the instructions given, dressing appropriately, showing up to a disaster site in shorts and flip-flops while it might be hot is not ideal if you plan to work on roofs or clear debris, and making sure you have all those proper PPEs, personal protective equipment, with you or that you were told to bring. And then risk management. Oftentimes when we talk about volunteers and disasters, the conversation of state laws and liabilities comes up. So there are workers' comp and Good Samaritan laws, and each state and community has different rules and laws. So it's just great to know prior to that event what your state laws and what your individual community laws and group restrictions are, and then just having all of those volunteers sign a release of liability. So we have several stakeholders. Many, I'm sure you could assume what they are.
As long as you can.
And local government would be involved, your community-based organizations, first responders, VOAD, which is our voluntary organizations active in disaster. Any kind of organization that's critical to your community would be part of our stakeholders, to include the media and schools. So previously I mentioned public messaging, and public messaging, especially when it comes to corralling those spontaneous volunteers, is critical, and it directs the flow of those unsolicited volunteers and unsolicited donations so that we can better manage them. we work together to have that one consistent messaging. So there's an acronym, CARE, which is cash, financial gifts, get help to people first. Here we say cash is best. Ask before donating. Volunteer Florida, we say cash confirm that there's a need. Respond by volunteering with local relief agencies, and everyone can help. So we do believe that there's a role for everyone. We believe that there's a proper way of going about matching those roles. And then the message and messenger should be established before the disaster. So we do work together with our partners to have those canned messaging, and we definitely like to push out prior to a disaster. Do not self-deploy, and there's a number of reasons for that.
There was a question in the chat box about having any templates for these disaster roles.
So we do have templates for the volunteer reception centers, and we can get those out to you, the typical roles. And I think we actually do go over a lot of those roles in future slides. So we're going to talk about setting up a virtual VRC. So oftentimes you will see a physical VRC, but as we move to more things being based, technology-based, we are seeing more of that virtual VRC. And so we've actually even experimented with that a little bit here at Volunteer Florida in the last 3 hurricane seasons. So you need to have a plan, just like you need to for your regular VRC, and having that banner that's going to go on your website, writing the messages, creating a call center, identifying and posting opportunities, and utilizing social media. So when you're planning, you need to discuss how you're going to use those spontaneous volunteers with the partner organizations. You need to also make sure your partner organizations know that you have a VRC open, whether it's a virtual VRC or a brick and mortar VRC. And then have those job descriptions, which we discussed, to post for those organizations. Identifying prior to a disaster the VRC locations. However, we just discovered after the storm you can do that planning all day long and nothing's there, so being flexible as well. And then creating those MOUs, as we mentioned, with whoever you see as those key personnel that need to have those MOUs in place with. And then you're going to want to have that local agreement. You're the local, and so you know who your local vendors are going to be, what your public messaging needs to be regarding spontaneous volunteers. In Bay County, they put out messaging on the radio to send them all to the library to register. And then exploring liability coverage. Again, we've talked about that. What's your liability going to look like, and who's going to have that coverage? When you're ready to stand up a VRC, you're going to recruit the VRC management teams. A lot of communities use established groups. So one of the trainings we do often is, I mentioned to you at the beginning that I'm the CERT program manager, so we have been training a lot of our CERT teams around the state to be that VRC management team. They have that training, they can stand up that VRC when we're ready to go. So you have to secure that space, as we mentioned, that's going to accommodate the volume you anticipate and just really show the flow. And later on we'll see a map of a suggestion of how to set up. And then you need your equipment, and then again, we're going to see a floor plan in a minute. So yes, you want to include a waiting area and administration areas, and you're going to have about 6 to 7 stations when you set up your VRC. So it's great if you can have a separate registration and volunteer sitting area, and then you're going to, it's best if you have like a flow of the room so that people can kind of go in a whole circle, start at the entrance and then exit. And if you have your computer up and are on the webinar, you can see a suggested flow up there. Something that I like to point out is that we do the safety briefing, and we do the majority of the interviews and the safety briefing prior to actually giving them that volunteer ID. So we make sure that they have had the proper training and such before we send them out the door. So briefly, we're going to do a quick overview of what the VRC team looks like. So this question of if we had the templates of the roles, this is a great place. And if you're not on the webinar, we can get those to you. We have the VRC director. They are the ones who just oversees the operations of the VRC. They coordinate the setup. And then if there's any issues between volunteers or staff, they're that director, and they often walk around and they thank all the volunteers on what to do and just kind of diffuse any situations, whether it's bottlenecks somewhere or the media shows up. They're just that lead person for the BRC. Then we have a greeter, who is that person, I mean, just as it sounds, who greets everyone as they come in and helps them register. Do you know who would serve as the VRC director in your community? A is yes, B is no, C is C is don't know. So I'm seeing a lot of people don't really know or aren't sure, and that's probable, and that's something that you need to discuss with your ESF 15, which is Volunteers and Donations Lead, on who would be the best person in your community. So then some continued roles of the VRC team are, we have the interviewer. We usually have a few interviewers sit and they do a quick interview just to determine what position the volunteer would be great for, and they'll refer them to the next station. And we often, when we do the exercise and show you how to set up your VRC, we have the interviewer sit in a way that doesn't always seem logical, but it's so that they can see the board behind the person they're interviewing and see what jobs are available to refer them. And they're kind of that first interaction to determine what's better. And then we have the data and agency collector, and they collect the referrals from the first spot, and they direct to kind of, to keep up that we've already sent enough volunteers to the Red Cross, and they keep up with that data management, and then they send you on to the next station, which is safety trainer, and they'll give you an overall safety briefing. Like I mentioned before, bring your water, don't wear sandals, wear closed-toe shoes, wear long sleeves. And it's a very general overall safety briefing if we know that there's, if you need your tetanus shot, a generalized one. And then later, if there's more specific job training, we'll send you on to that. Then, as I mentioned previously, we do that safety training. We get that interview done before we give you that volunteer ID badge. It looks different depending where you are. Most places do an ID bracelet of some sort that they can write on your dates, and they maybe change the colors each day. Then we send you over to see the maps, because although you might be very familiar with the community, a lot of times the disaster has taken away the landmarks we might know. So we have a map, or we have a map for those who are not from around the area, so that they'll be able to identify where the work sites are. Some other roles that we have is a phone bank. That's a great place to put volunteers that come through the VRC as well. And they'll handle those calls that'll come in from the other organizations who are seeking volunteers, or just general people wanting to volunteer who have questions. Other jobs that we think are important is to have a PIO, a public information officer, on site. You will a lot of times get media inquiries, so to have that face for you, that's a great role if you can have that person. Security is a critical role as well. And then additional data entry folks and runners are always a great addition to that staff to help run between the VRC. So when that dust settles, you'll want to follow up with the volunteers as much as you're able. Those who came in and maybe didn't even volunteer, it's great to shoot them an email. Why didn't you? Get some feedback on their experience. But also, you can recruit from those volunteers for other opportunities. So they clearly have a need or they have an interest in volunteering. So we may have other projects. Volunteers are needed well into recovery, years following a disaster. So you can recruit them for longer term projects and for preparedness, to go out and table and put out preparedness information for the community or other preparedness projects that may come along. And then you want to invite them to participate in any after action meetings you have, because they were the boots on the ground, so they can share those lessons learned with the stakeholders. And then, of course, we always, as with everything, incorporate those actual lessons learned into future planning, and then just maintain those ongoing relationships. Do we have any questions, thoughts, ideas, suggestions?
I do have a question. has been your experience in retention for emergency volunteers and long-term engagement with the organization?
So we do see this spring up and this desire to volunteer immediately following a disaster, which is great. And then to retain them, we do keep them involved in that planning process. So CERT teams are based on volunteers, and so they do a lot of exercises. They involve them in those after actions, and they try to just incorporate them to maintain them. The other thing is that, as I mentioned, a disaster recovery is a long-term process. We do have groups who just, in this most recent disaster, have committed to working in communities for 2 years, volunteering for 2 years. So if we can connect those individuals up with groups like that to show them, to give them an opportunity in the next 2 years to volunteer, that's worked well for engaging them. And then lastly, we, in these communities that have been impacted, we have long-term recovery groups that form, and they're always looking for volunteers to help meet those unmet needs. So we also would link them with that.
Another question is, any best practices on frequency of follow-up, once a month, a quarter, to retain their engagement?
So I know here in the beginning when we pulled those virtual volunteers, we were pretty regularly following up, maybe every few days to let them know about the opportunities. And as it slowed down, it was less, maybe once a week, and I'd say maybe once a quarter now. That's how we do. So you need to have that rollout plan. It's going to be heavy in the front end, and then slowly on the other end. And thanking them each time too, because even if they don't serve, they had that interest in serving.
Are there any other questions or comments that you would like to share with Christy? Okay, so hearing none, I'm going to move. We do have some more information. The Florida CERT, you can go onto this website and you can actually find an in-live training in your community. It's a 2-day training, and what's great is that it actually takes you through the entire steps of creating a BRC. I've participated in it before, and then a part of it is an actual, each person got a role, and then you got to filter through as a volunteer and as a person setting it up. So it was a really great tool. And I do know that Volunteer Florida does have some resources for the volunteer reception center that we'll share as well, which you could then modify and use in your communities. But again, use this website to track any of the trainings, but the VRC ones are in there as well. And then my last thing before we go on to updates is just to say thank you to Christy for coming. I don't know if many of you have met Christy before, but she joined our team 3 years ago, and within her first month, Hurricane Hermine happened. So she has been in the field for practically her entire time at Volunteer Florida. And so currently she's in the Panhandle working with Matthew Recovery in response. So again, thank you. I'm going to share her information with you guys. So if you have any more specific questions on your organization or any other disaster related things, she could help. And I know we have many resources that we could share as well. And then since I have you all on the call, I just wanted to give some high level updates again. Financial invoices are due on the 15th, which is Friday for this one. So the January PR is due this Friday. A mid-year report will be due April 15th. I'll be sending out how to report and some more instructions about a month before. You have 3 budget revisions that you can do throughout the year. The final one is due June 1st. And then if you're interested, if you're not currently an AmeriCorps grantee, but you are interested in bringing your AmeriCorps to your community, there is a webinar, which is next week, next Tuesday. And then the next Thursday, there's an in-person meeting in Collier County. So if you're over in that area or if you have some connections to that, please share the webinar information because you'll get to meet some of our office and learn more about how to bring this great program to your community. So that is it. If you have any questions or suggestions on other topics you would like to hear on the webinar series, please let me know and we can try to incorporate that. But again, I will be sending out a copy of this recording along with some of the resources that Christy mentioned in her session. So thank you guys again.